army was the genesis of the song. I did not know that. In my mind, I'd always assumed it probably was from the Civil War just because of the timing of it. But it makes so much more sense that you say that. And one of the things that I was thinking about while I was looking at this second verse is that the second verse were written today accurately about the church in America. I think we would have to say this. Like a fearful army moves the church of God. Brothers, we are treading where we've always trod. We are oft divided, not one body. We shattered in I don't know, I can't come up with what else was there, but we'd be fearful. We're a fearful, anxious, trepidatious church, and we need to get over that. We've got to become more bold in our confrontation of the wicked culture that is around us. In Numbers chapter 13, you have the Israelites on the border of going into the Promised Land. While you're thinking about that, we'll read the first 3 verses in a minute. I want you to think about fearfulness. Fearfulness is that thing that cripples us. It's kind of a paralysis. We really deal with it from even a young age. I mean, one little guy lived at home, and his mom had asked him to go get a broom off of the back porch. Well, the back porch was screened in, and it was pitch black back there, and he'd always been scared of the dark, and he was kind of reticent about going out, and the mom wanted to comfort him and said, well, look, you need to understand, Jesus is everywhere. He's out in that back porch too. And so the little guy thought about it for a minute. He opened the door and said, Jesus, if you're there, would you hand me the broom? Then another kid, he was having trouble sleeping, waking up with night terrors, and he asked his mom if she'd sleep in the room with him. And she said, honey, I can't do that. I've got to sleep with Daddy. And the kid said under his breath, the big sissy. We do deal with fear. And fear is not just something that kids feel. We feel it as well. We deal with this concept of fear. And unfortunately, Satan has used it to paralyze us and to keep us from moving into the realm of effectiveness and blessing that God has for us. They were on the border of the Promised Land, but they were not going to make it in if they were over 20 years old because of fear that stopped them. Here's point number 1. God positions us at the threshold of promise. In Numbers 13, 1 through 3, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Send now men, that they may search out the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel. Of every tribe of the fathers shall ye send a man, every one a ruler among them. And Moses, by commandment of the Lord, sent them from the wilderness of Paran. All those men were heads of the children of Israel. And so God here has finally brought them through the wilderness, out of Egypt. The Red Sea split. They came across. Pharaoh's army was drowned. 800 chariots buried beneath the Red Sea. Their celebration takes place. They move on through the wilderness. They make their way to the border of the Promised Land. Here they are. They're either on the threshold of opportunity or the border of disorder, and they choose to focus on the disorder and fear that is in the land because these spies bring back this negative message. The old-timers that would talk about leadership, what they would say is this: better 100 lambs led by a lion than 100 lions led by a lamb. See, they had picked out leaders to go into the land of promise and see what was there. But the purpose of them going in wasn't to determine whether they could or could not fight this battle. They'd already been told by God in this passage, the land which I give unto the children of Israel. In other words, God was saying, it's a done deal. I've given this land to you. I want you to go in and look around. And what they were supposed to do was to get a preview of coming attraction. They were supposed to go in, look around, and be so amazed by the milk and honey, by the fruitfulness of the land, by how it was going to meet their needs. They would come back and bolster the courage and faith of the children of Israel as they went in. Instead, 10 of them come back and go, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. They're giants, fortified cities, and they come back with this negative message, and it cripples the children of Israel. We've got to develop a different spirit than that. We need to be bolder than that. We need to be like Elisha and want a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Instead, it seems as though each generation has become more and more fearful, less and less powerful in the culture in which we live. And so I believe that The fault of a lot of what's gone on in our culture has to be laid at the foot of the church. Because the church has not been what she needs to be. Because of that, the culture has taken over. They have become very bold, while we're very shy and reticent. I like what Pastor Sammy was talking about, Eric Ness. Eric makes me look like a quiet, shy kid in a corner. I don't know if you've talked to him much. He's pretty vibrant, pretty loud. But he boldly went up and talked to this family. And then as a result of that moment of boldness, we have a brand new ministry here at our church. You know what I mean? And so I wonder how much we lack within the kingdom of God because we haven't developed a spirit of holy boldness about what God is calling us to do. In 1519, Hernan Cortez landed with 600 men to go up against the Aztec Empire of millions of people. And what he did in order for his men not to chicken out is his first order was they burned the ships so that they could not go back. There was no pathway back to Spain, and they would have to move forward. So here the children of Israel, really God had given them their ship-burning moment, because as soon as the waters engulfed the 800 chariots of Egypt, they were persona non grata back in Egypt. And after the 10 plagues, persona non grata. They had no standing back where they came from. They had no choice but to go forward or to stay in the wilderness. And they built ships in their heart. They couldn't build them physically to go back. They could not go back, but they weren't going to go forward either. They're going to stay in some kind of a limbo. And that's unacceptable. It's certainly not what God wants. So God positions us at the threshold of promise. You may be on the border of a breakthrough in your life. You might be right where God wants you to be. You might be one step away from God doing something supernatural in your life. But if we live in fear, we'll never see it. Because we stop short, we pull up, we pull back, we stay out of what God has called us to go into. And so here's a second point, is our perspective determines our response to God's promise. It says in verse 30 to 33 of Numbers 13, Caleb is one of my heroes in the Old Testament. Caleb is this 80-year-old, tenacious, aggressive, assertive, faith-filled guy. He's not. Now Joshua is the other one that you'll see here, and we kind of follow Joshua's account through the passages. But Caleb, he's a layman, but he just is so bold. Listen to what goes on. And Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it." But the men that went up with him said, "We be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." And they brought up an evil report of the land which they searched unto the children of Israel, saying, "The land which we have gone in to search is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. All the people that we saw in it are the sons of Anak." We saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. "And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, so we were in their sight." Caleb later would say, "Give me the mountain where the giants lived." Literally, when he does get to go in, I hate to give you a spoiler alert here, but Caleb and Joshua are the only ones above 20 years old that are going to go into the land of promise. And so when Caleb goes in, he doesn't ask for some sedate place by a river with a green pasture. He says, "I want the mountain where the giants live." And he was ready to go in and fight some giants. And so he wasn't just talking brave talk about what somebody else needed to do. He was saying, "I'm willing to fight some giants today. Yeah, I'm 80, but I'm willing to whoop some giants." You gotta love the size of the fight in that old dog. And that's what his name means, is dog. And if he was a dog, he was a pit bull that would hold on and tear up the enemy. But you gotta love that. But here, these other 10 they go into the same place, statistically see the same thing, but they come back and give an opposite report. That's a bizarre deal. Now, one of the things you need to understand, sometimes you'll hear stuff on TV where they'll say statistics say this or say that. There's a book out there you might want to get a hold of. It says How to Lie with Statistics. And that's a real book. It's not something I'm making up. And what you need to understand is sometimes they don't tell you all the parameters that they use in the study that they bring forward. Sometimes they don't tell you who sponsored the study that they put forward. They don't tell you how they weighted the input of the study. Now, what I mean by weighted is this. So say you have something that you're studying that has maybe 10 factors in it, 10 things that may contribute to this one thing that you're trying to figure out how it happens. Now, a study is easy if there's only one thing that makes this thing happen. You don't have to have a study because you know why it happened. But you have 10 possible things that make this thing happen. You don't really know which one of them is the most important of those things that made this one thing happen. And so what happens in studies is they often weight some evidence more than other evidence. And in other words, they may have one part of the statistical facts that they look at and say, these are more important than these, but that's what they're looking at. Well, these guys that went into the land of promise, the 10 spies weighted the fortified cities that were there. There were fortified cities. There's a picture that exists of me on the internet of me riding a camel. Where I'm riding the camel is in Jericho, where the ruins are of one of the fortified cities that was there. So I can tell you the 10 spies were accurate when they said there were fortified cities. When I was in Israel, they talked about one of the guys when we were in, I think it was the Valley of Jezreel. We were headed up to Solomon's stables that were there. And the guy mentioned something. It was kind of an offhand remark, but he said that there was a lot of archaeological evidence in Israel and in other countries indeed, but he was talking about Israel, of a megalithic society. A megalithic society is a society where everything in the society is kind of gigantic. It's larger than it needs to be. We build doorways here in America that are based on the height of the people that are in the community. So we don't often have 12-foot doors. We typically have the ones that are about the size where an average person can walk through without knocking their noggin. Well, in the megalithic societies, everything in the structures were built to look like giants lived there. Big people lived there. And of course, you have the account of David and Goliath in the battle in 1 Samuel 17. And elsewhere in the same book, it talks about 4 other giants from the same city of Gath. Now, maybe one mama was giving birth to a whole lot of great big chillins. I have no idea. But somehow, there are 5 giants that are in that particular community. And these guys were apparently massive. And so the 10 spies weren't being inaccurate when they came back and said there are giants in the land. There are fortified cities in the land. But here's the problem. They weighted that information to have more impact than the information that God was the one sending them in. And so they said, here's their statement. They said this. They said, we were as grasshoppers in our own sight. In other words, their self-perception shaped their faith. How they saw themselves was shaping the amount of faith that they had, and they should have inverted that. Their faith should have shaped their self-perception. In other words, yeah, there are giants, but God is making you a giant killer. Yes, there are fortified cities, but God is going to move with you to knock down the walls of the fortified cities. So Joshua and Caleb weighted the reality of the presence and power of God greater than the reality of the giants of the fortified cities. And so only 2 came back with the right understanding and the right report. But these 10 infected a virus of fear among the people of God. And that fearfulness wrecked a generation. We have to be careful that our message is a message of truth and faith in a God that can handle anything that comes our way. Think of it this way. A.W. Tozer said this, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Your theology of who God is and how powerful God is by far the most important thing about us. Because the truth is, if you take God out of this scenario, if God is not existent in Numbers 13, then perhaps the 10 spies were right. If there is no God, or if that God is a weak God, that God's an emaciated God, a not powerful God, a local deity, then maybe the 10 were right. But we do have God, and what we think about God determines what we accomplish for God. Because it's not me against the giants, it's not me against the fortified cities, it's God and me against the giants, God and me against the fortified cities, and God and me against whatever battle you may be facing at this moment. You've seen this. We talk a lot about disease here because I think most of us are past 50. At 50, every check engine light on your body's dashboard flips on. You know, you're pretty much rocking along your 20s, 30s, and 40s. Things are pretty good. You hit 50, and all of a sudden, there's warning lights, there's pains that you can't identify. You get a new pain, and you wonder if this is some diagnosis that you have, or if this is just going to be the way life is from this moment forward. And so, we talk about disease, but you know, when we're facing some debilitating disease, what your perspective is determines really how well you're going to be able to fight that disease. So you know people that got an almost identical diagnosis. They were in almost identical physical shape, almost an identical diagnosis, but because when one heard the diagnosis, they gave up instantly. They said, well, I guess that's it. You know, and they just literally started to die from that moment on. But then you had other people who had that identical diagnosis, but they believed in a God that was powerful enough to move even in medical situations, and they prayed to God that spoke the cosmos into existence. They believed that they served a great physician, and so they moved into it with a radically different mindset. And your mindset affects how your body deals with disease. A man named Norman Cousins, he had been given during the course of his lifetime 2 different terminal diagnoses, and I think they were both from Johns Hopkins University. So it wasn't kind of a substandard hospital or doctor that gave him the diagnosis. And he ended up he was going through one. The doctors told him to kind of go home and die. And so he began to think about this, and he thought, you know what? If negative emotions affect the body negatively, so that if I'm angry, I'm twice as likely to die of a heart attack. If I'm fearful, I'm more likely to get an ulcer. And you could go on and list things that might give you high blood pressure or certain other things based on negative emotions. He said if negative emotions do that, what if positive emotions create a positive healing in the body or help the body to heal? And so what he did was, it's the weirdest medical intervention I've ever heard of. He went out and he bought a reel-to-reel projector. This is way back in the day, reel-to-reel. You guys know what it is. If I mentioned it in the congregation in there, 90% of them would have no idea what I'm talking about. A reel-to-reel projector. And he went out and he bought some Three Stooges movies. And what was it? Three Stooges and something else. I can't remember. There was other comedy movies, and he started playing them over and over again. What he found was, if he could laugh for just 1 minute, he could have almost half an hour pain-free. It just the laughter, the joy of seeing Shemp or him, poke each other in the eyes made him laugh, and somehow that positive emotion affected how his body healed. He ended up surviving these 2 different terminal diagnoses. He wrote a book called Head First, which is what it's about. But that's kind of fascinating to me. So this one person who hears the diagnosis, well, it's all over. Nothing else we can do. It's all over. And then somebody else says, boy, I bet me and God could fight this, and move forward. I think you're probably going to get a radically different outcome. Think about this too. Vance Havner, one of my favorite preachers of all time is Vance Havner. If you ever get a chance to get one of his books, get them. They are wonderful. He graduated from the same year and same Bible college as Billy Graham. They were friends. He was such a good preacher. Vance got real sick down in Florida, had to go into the hospital, and he was really sick. And Billy Graham called his wife, and he said to her, I believe God's going to raise Vance up. He said, if God doesn't raise Vance up, where are we going to get our sermons? Because he was so quotable. At one time, he was the most quoted preacher in America. But one of his poems that I remember is, two men looked through prison bars. One saw mud, the other saw stars. In other words, your perspective, two guys in exactly the same situation, but their perspective in the situation was radically different. And here's another thought. Your attitude determines your altitude. If you're going to have this fearful, fear-based attitude, then it's going to affect what you can do and accomplish for God. Point 3. Fear makes the familiar feel safer than God's promises. Listen to Numbers 14, 1 through 3. And all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night, and all the children of Israel murmured against Moses, against Aaron, and the whole congregation said unto them, would to God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would to God that we had died in this wilderness, and wherefore hath the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should be prey? Were it not better for us to return to Egypt? Their response to this is, I want to go back to being a slave. I want to go back to where they were beating me every day when I couldn't produce enough bricks to build the buildings in Egypt. I want to go back to that because I'm scared of what's here. We're like the guy that's in the middle of a raging river. He'd fallen into it in a flood time, and he grabbed a hold of a rock, but he couldn't kind of catch himself, and the river was smashing him against the rock. The river would come in, and then he'd smash against the rock, come in, and he was getting just beat up by this. And a guy in the bank said, why don't you let go? And he said, because I don't know what's downstream. And that fear of what we don't know keeps us from accomplishing what God wants us to accomplish. They were on the border, the threshold of the promise of God. This is what they've been living for, dreaming about, praying for, as they cried unto God in the land of Egypt. And there they are on the cusp of it. And they won't go in because they don't know what's going to happen. Look, if you're looking for a life with guarantees, there are no guarantees. That's not how life works. Life doesn't come with this rock-solid promise that everything's going to be a rose-strewn pathway to the heavens. That's not at all how it works. Instead, God, when you're born again, you were born into a spiritual warfare, and you need to look at your life that way. So Egypt had represented oppression, but for them it also represented predictability. At least you knew what was going to happen the next day. You know? At least you knew it was the devil you knew. Is kind of how they thought of it. Have you ever met somebody that's in a physically abusive relationship and you counsel them to leave? You beg them to leave. You show them where they can go to get out of this abusive relationship, and sometimes they won't go at all because they don't know what life's going to be like outside of that. And then some of them, even when they go and life becomes unfamiliar, they become more afraid of the unfamiliar and go back to an abusive relationship. And you want to go, why? Why are you doing that? Get free. But our fear of the unknown, it's terrifying to us. We've got to get over it. God rewards when we take risks in faith. John Ortberg wrote a book. He said, the title of the book is great. I love this title. If you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. And that's right. You know, we're all critical of Peter, because Peter got out and he walked on the water and he looked at the waves and he went under the water. But where were the rest of the disciples? They were in the boat. They never walked on water. The one thing Peter can say is, do you remember the day I walked on the water? None of the other disciples could say that because they didn't get out of the boat. And the kid that gave his lunch to Jesus and he turns it into a feeding of the multitudes, he gave Jesus his lunch. Sometimes these small actions of faith in just a short period of time can transform everything for us. We've got to take risks, and with high risk comes high reward. But that means that we've got to do things that we're not comfortable with.